Hi, I'm Kelly Lees, Education Officer Honeybees at Tocal College, and I'm here to talk to you today about different hive types and the pros and cons of each hive type. Before I get started, I wanted to talk to you very briefly about managing honeybees. It doesn't matter what hive type you use, the management of the bees is the same. So you do need to check for pests and diseases and manage the colony in the same way, regardless of which hive type you have. This hive that I have here is a 10-frame Langstroth hive. So Langstroth hives come in 8-frame and 10-frame. This is a 10-frame. They have a few basic parts. So they have a bottom board and a landing board where the bees go in and out. This box is called the brood box. Then we have a queen excluder, the honey super, which is where the bees store the honey, and the lid. So if we take off the lid, you can have a look inside. Basically inside you'll find wired and waxed frames, and this is the most common kind of hive type used by commercial beekeepers and a lot of recreational keepers as well, and you can use wax foundation or plastic foundation. So these are in the super. If we lift off the super, you'll see that this is the queen excluder. So for beginners I recommend that you do use a queen excluder. The queen excluder is designed to keep the queen in the lower box in the brood box so that when you're inspecting your hive you know where the queen is. So she can't fit through the mesh. In the lower box is where the brood is kept, and this is where the queen is. So the queen lays all of her eggs in the brood box, and we usually use wax foundation in the brood box. So when you're inspecting a hive, you're removing these frames and you're checking on both sides to look at the brood, which is the young bees, to make sure that there's no pests or diseases. You need to do a minimum of 2 brood inspections a year, and you need to look at a minimum of 3 frames when you do that brood inspection. In terms of pros and cons for this hive, they're made of timber, so they're very hard wearing and durable as long as you treat the timber beforehand. So a lot of beekeepers will dip them in what's called copper naphthenate to treat the timber and then paint them, or you can also hot wax dip them. So they'll last a long time. The flip side of that is they do tend to be heavy. So if you're a smaller person or not as strong, lifting the honey supers can be difficult. So this is a flow hive. A flow hive is a modified Langstroth hive. So basically they have the same components as a Langstroth hive. They have a bottom board. They have a brood box, which is where the queen and the brood live. They have a queen excluder, a super, and a lid. Now, the super is where they really differ from a Langstroth hive, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm just going to lift this super off. So down in the brood box with the flow hive, if you buy a flow hive, they actually come with foundationless frames. So the frames don't have the wire and wax that we saw in the other hive. So I want to talk about the pros and cons of a flow hive in terms of the brood box and also the honey super. So for beginners, foundationless frames can be difficult. With wired and wax frames, the bees have a barrier, so they have to draw out this comb. But if you have a box full of foundationless frames, basically when you put the bees in, instead of going horizontally along the frame, they might go acrossways. So they might build the comb across all of the frames, making it difficult for you to remove those frames. So if you are going to get a flow hive, I recommend that when you first start out, you do use wired and wax frames instead of the foundationless frames. Up in the honey super is where things are really different with the flow hive. So one of the pros of a flow hive is that you can actually extract the honey without taking the frames out. Inside the flow super they have these patented flow frames which are made out of food grade plastic, and they have this zigzag pattern of honeycomb. And basically the bees fill that plastic in the same way that they would fill a wax foundation, and then they cap it like normal, putting wax over the top. Now the flow hive actually has a viewing window at the side where you can see what the bees are doing inside the hive. So when you take off this covering, you can actually see the bees working, and sometimes you'll see that that's been capped. Now one of the tricky things One of the cons about this system is that these flow frames aren't really designed to come out. They're a very tight fit. And sometimes the bees will be working from the centre to the outside or the outside to the centre. And so when you see this as capped or uncapped, it's difficult to tell if the frames in the middle have been capped before you extract that honey. So it is really important that you do try to take one out to have a look before you extract it. In the rear of the hive is another access window where you can see the ends of the frames. So how they work is that you remove a little plug in the top of the frame and you remove a plug in the bottom, which is where you put the tube for the honey to run out. You then insert the key into the frame and you turn it. What turning it does is it moves the cells of the plastic frame apart from each other, and the honey runs to the bottom of the frame and runs out the bottom of the super. So in terms of extracting honey, it's much more simple. You don't need an extractor, and so you need less equipment. I will stress that in terms of managing the bees, it's very important that you look in your brood box just like you would with a standard Langstroth hive. After you've extracted the honey, you insert the key on the other side and turn it back, and this resets the cells ready for the bees to fill them again. And then you remove the key. So in terms of extracting, it's much simpler, making sure that you do inspect your bees as normal. And resetting it for the bees so that they can start again. So the other thing I just wanted to talk about with Flow Hive very briefly, which can be a con, is the concept of bee space. So bee space is where bees can walk back to back past each other in between two frames in a beehive. Now it's quite a specific measurement, and with your Langstroth hives you have that ability to space the frames to make sure that you are observing bee space. It's the space that they would naturally build in a natural hive. Now, if you compare the space in a Langstroth hive with the space within a flow frame, it's much tighter, so bees actually can't walk back to back inside the flow super. So this means that they can have a tendency to feel crowded, and that means that they can have a tendency to swarm more frequently than a standard Langstroth hive because they run out of space quicker. So one of the ways that you can manage this is actually to run a Langstroth box with wired and wax frames on your flow hive so that they feel like they have enough space, so they don't have that swarming tendency. So this is a polystyrene hive. It is a Langstroth hive. So the only difference with this hive is the fact that it's made from high density polystyrene. Now it has the same basic layout as the timber Langstroth hive. It has a bottom board, it has a brood box, sometimes has a queen excluder, a super and a lid. So in terms of the management of the bees, it's identical to the Langstroth hive. You're still doing pest and disease inspections. Pros and cons of this hive: it's very light because it's made out of polystyrene, so in terms of weight reduction, that's a benefit. The other thing is that it's got high insulative value, so the transfer of heat and cold from inside to outside is very minimal. So if you live in a climate that's very cold or very hot, these are quite good because the bees don't have to work as hard heating or cooling. So inside they look basically the same. They have a lid, they have a honey super where you would have wired and waxed frames. Now the reason I said they sometimes have a queen excluder is that I've found that the fit for the queen excluders is one of the cons of this hive. So they're very tight fit. They're designed to fit right up against the two boxes, so between the brood box and the super. And they're okay when you first put them on, but once the bees have been in the hive for a little while and they've put propolis on that excluder, getting it to fit back in that position perfectly can be quite difficult. So because the boxes are designed to sit down on top of one another to minimise air gaps, that excluder sometimes won't go back on. So that is definitely a downside to these hives. The other downside is, from a commercial perspective, they do dent. Although commercial beekeepers do use them, they're just a little bit easier to damage than the timber hive. So you do have to take a bit more care in terms of lifting them and moving them around. But the insulative value, I think, perhaps outweighs that downside. Some people might think that a downside of these hives is that they're made from polystyrene. However, they have been using them in Europe for 40 plus years, so they have a longevity similar to the timber hives. They do need to be painted like the timber hives to preserve them in the UV light. However, at the end of their useful life, they can actually be powdered up and used in concrete foundations. Okay, this is a juare hive. Now, a juare hive is sometimes referred to as a form of natural beekeeping. And the reason they say that is because the bees build their own comb within the hive instead of drawing out wax foundation. So these hives don't use wax foundation. They're quite a different setup to a standard Langstroth hive, which we've looked at previously. So they have this very complicated gabled roof. Basically, this roof is designed for insulation. So you can see when I take it off, it's got a big solid area inside, and insulation is usually added inside that box to keep the bees warm. They then have a box on top which is smaller than the other boxes, called the quilt box, and they will put insulation in this as well to keep the bees warm. This lower box, it's just called a box. They don't call it a brood box or a super. Basically, with a juare hive, you have to start off with a swarm or a package of bees because of the size of the frame. So it's square rather than rectangular. And inside the box we have these foundationless three-sided frames. The idea is that the bees build comb in here in a natural arc rather than in a square shape designated by a person. So you catch your bees, you pop them in there, they build natural comb in those frames. When that box is completely full, with juare beekeeping, what we do is we lift up this box and we put another box down the bottom and add this box back on top. There is no queen excluder. The idea is that as the brood builds out, the queen, if it's spring and summer, the queen will move down into the lower box and lay brood in the bottom box. And then once the brood up here hatches, the bees will put honey in here. So there's a constant rotation where the boxes are lifted up and a box is added on the bottom. Honey is removed from the top. Now, this leads to one of the downsides of the juare hive, because when you're adding boxes, usually what's done is all the boxes are lifted up together. So you do need a hive lifter in order to lift all the boxes up to add a box on the bottom. One of the other cons for a beginner especially is the foundationless frame. Much like the foundationless frames in the flow hive, the bees may or may not choose to go in the direction of the frame. Sometimes they go crossways, making it difficult to remove frames. That means that you can't adequately do a pest and disease inspection because you can't remove the frames from the hive. So you do need a hive lifter. It can be difficult to get the bees to go in the right direction. The other thing is you do have to crush the comb when you extract honey. So you take the frames out and you cut the comb out and then you crush it in a press, or you can squeeze it by hand. So it's a very different way of managing bees. However, in terms of its inspecting for pests and diseases and managing the brood, it's identical to the other hives. So it is really important that you are doing consistent brood inspections to make sure that the bees are healthy. So in terms of the management of the bees, for beginners, as I mentioned, this hive type doesn't actually use an excluder. So the idea is that the brood moves up and down depending on the weather. And so that means that when you're doing your inspections, you are searching for your queen so that you don't accidentally take her home in the honey super, because she is free to move throughout the hive. You can add lots of boxes to a juare hive. So you're just lifting it up, adding one on the bottom. Sometimes you're taking one off the top, but you can have up to 5 or 6 boxes added to the top, and the bees just move through that hive, building comb and filling them with honey. So the last hive I'd like to talk about is a top bar hive, sometimes called an African top bar hive or a Kenyan top bar hive. So these are hives that are built at hip height, and basically they use a foundationless frame system much like the juare hives. So when you open up a top bar hive, they have a big lid, you open up that lid, and inside what you're greeted with is frames pressed tightly against one another. So there's no gaps between the frames. When you lift the frames out, the bees build V-shaped or round comb, depending on the way the top bar hive has been built. Now, In terms of pros and cons of a top bar hive, the great thing about them is they're really good for people with disabilities or with injuries or older people who have difficulty lifting or bending, because they're built at hip height. There's no bending over the hive. You just open the lid and you're working it at a very comfortable height. In terms of cons, the top bar hive is limited in space to the length that it's been constructed. So if it's 1 metre long, the bees have 1 metre of space. If it's 2 metres long, the bees have 2 metres of space. So in terms of management, you do need to manage removing honey from the top bar hive, because they can quickly run out of space, particularly in spring and summer when they're very, very busy. And so there's no area where you can add additional space to that hive. They generally will put the brood towards the front of the top bar hive and then fill the back with honey. In terms of another con is that they can do similar to the flow hive and the juare hive, in that they may not go along the length of the frame, but rather go along the length of the hive, making it difficult to remove those top bars. So you do need to be on top of your management so that you are able to remove those frames to inspect them. Now, there is a variation on the top bar hive, sometimes called a coffin hive. And basically this is a hive that is like a Langstroth hive. It uses wired and wax frames. It's the same dimensions as a Langstroth hive, but like a top bar hive, it's built on legs at hip height. Now, these do have the capacity to have boxes added to them on one end going up. So it's a variation on a top bar hive that means you can manage space a bit more adequately. They do have the wired and waxed frames, which means that inspecting is made easy because the bees will follow that frame. So in terms of choosing a hive, it really comes down to personal preference. It comes down to your particular circumstances and how you want to manage your bees. Most of the hives are managed in the same way, so it's really important that you remember that regardless of the type of hive you get, in terms of actually managing the colony for health and strength and pests and diseases, the management is the same. You must inspect your brood box or the brood nest of the hive to make sure that there aren't any diseases and that there aren't any pests and that you have a healthy laying queen. The main difference between all of these hive types is the way that you extract and manage your honey production. So with a Langstroth hive with wired and waxed frames, you are using an extractor. Decapping they're taking the wax off the surface and then spinning them in an extractor. So you do need additional equipment. In terms of your juare hive and your top bar hive, you are crushing the comb, so you do need a fruit press or some other method of squashing the honey out of the frames and then replacing those frames. With the flow hive, obviously you're extracting directly from the hive, so there's no need for additional equipment. Really, that is the main difference, is the way that you're managing the honey. In terms of managing the bees, they're all very much the same. In terms of the hive that you choose, really, I had something to say then, just out the window.